Jiang Minjie's eyes burned as he rewound the footage for the 10th time, his thumb hovering over the execute command on his tablet. The timestamp on the monitor glowed a jagged green, 3:47 a.m. Inside his soundproofed command center, the air felt thin, heavy with the scent of expensive cologne and the cold ozone of high-end servers. There she was, Saad, the caregiver with the quiet strength he had come to loathe because he couldn't break it. On the screen, she was a ghost in the night vision grain, creeping toward his mother's bedside with a heavy, unidentified object gripped in her hands. Minjie's jaw tightened. He had suspected her since the day she arrived with those burdened eyes and refused to be intimidated by his guards. His sister's whispers of a stolen legacy and Sada's hushed, emotional phone calls at midnight had all led to this moment. He was certain she was a scavenger, a predator sent by his enemies to pick the bones of the Kim Empire through a dying woman. Minjie had built his reputation on the absolute absence of trust. In his world, a miracle was just a con he hadn't figured out yet. He watched Saad lean over his mother, Mrs. Kim Sun-ok, whose frail body looked like brittle porcelain against the dark silk sheets. Minjie's finger moved to the intercom button. One word to the men stationed at the gate, and Saad Mensa would be erased. Not just fired, but vanished from the face of Seoul as if she had never existed. He leaned forward, the light of the monitors reflecting in his cold, calculating eyes as he prepared to deliver justice. But then, the high-definition camera inside the headboard flickered, providing a clear angle of his mother's face. Mrs. Kim was awake, her eyes wide and wet with the terrifying fog of her illness, reaching out for a husband who had been in the ground for a decade. As Saad entered the full light of the bedside lamp, she didn't raise a weapon. She knelt. What she pulled from her pocket wasn't a tool of betrayal, but the glowing, ornate key Minjie's father had hidden years ago, the one his mother had been begging for in her delirium. What Saad did next, the way she pressed that key into the old woman's trembling hands and began to weep alongside her, made the unbeatable Mafia boss feel the floor drop out from beneath his feet. Saad Mensa watched the neon blur of Seoul through the window of the black Mercedes, but her mind was 4,000 miles away in a cramped, oxygen-scented apartment in Atlanta. Every rhythmic thrum of the tires felt like the ticking of a clock she couldn't stop, a countdown to the moment her father's lungs would finally give up. Her nursing degree from Emory had taught her how to save lives, but it hadn't taught her how to navigate the cold, bureaucratic cruelty of an insurance company that had deemed her father's survival non-essential. She closed her eyes, leaning her forehead against the cool glass. She could still hear the rattle in his chest as he'd begged her not to go, not to sacrifice her youth for his fading breath. But Saad was a woman built of iron and empathy. She had watched him work 3 jobs to put her through school, and she would walk through fire to return the favor. When the elite agency contacted her about a private, high-security placement in South Korea, with a salary that seemed more like a bribe than a wage, she hadn't hesitated. She didn't care that the contract was thick with non-disclosure agreements or that the background check felt like an interrogation. She only saw the money, $30,000. The exact price of the experimental clinical trial that was her father's last hope. As the car pulled through the industrial hydraulic gates of the Kim mansion, Saad felt a shiver of pure, instinctual dread. She had seen the way the driver's hand never strayed far from the holster beneath his jacket, and she'd noticed the cameras that followed their every movement like predatory eyes. She knew she was entering a den of lions. The man she was coming to work for, Jiang Minjie, was a name whispered in the darkest corners of the city, a man whose power was built on shadows and bone. A woman of Sada's integrity should have turned back. She should have feared the severe consequences Minjie had threatened during their first, ice-cold meeting. But as she adjusted the small, worn Bible in her bag and smoothed her scrubs, her resolve didn't flicker. She wasn't here for the Mafia or their blood-stained empire. She was here for a sick woman who needed a daughter's touch, and for a father who needed a miracle. If working for a monster was the price of saving a saint, Saad Mensa would pay it without blinking. She stepped out of the car, her quiet strength masking the heartbreak she carried, ready to face whatever darkness lay behind the mansion's heavy doors. The heavy oak doors of the master suite creaked open, revealing a room that felt less like a bedroom and more like a sanctuary frozen in time. Saad stepped softly onto the thick silk rugs, her eyes immediately finding the frail figure of Mrs. Kim Sun-ok huddled in a high-backed chair by the window. The elderly woman looked like a bird with broken wings, her silver hair catching the late afternoon light, but it was her eyes, clear, perceptive, and filled with a sudden, sharp intelligence, that made Saad pause. There was no fear in those eyes, only a weary wisdom that seemed to see right through Saada's professional mask to the daughter grieving for a father back in Atlanta. "You have the scent of rain on you," Mrs. Kim whispered in a voice like rustling parchment. Saad knelt beside her, the movement practiced and humble, and took the woman's thin, cold hand in her own. "It's a good scent," Saad replied softly. "It means growth." For the first time in weeks, the tension in Mrs. Kim's shoulders seemed to vanish, replaced by a tentative warmth. In that silent exchange, Saad realized that while the rest of the house treated this woman as a delicate problem to be managed or a legacy to be guarded, Mrs. Kim was simply a soul yearning for a moment of genuine human connection. The door behind them swung open with a violent suddenness that made the air in the room drop several degrees. Jang Min-jae stood in the threshold, his tailored suit a sharp contrast to the soft edges of his mother's room. His gaze was a predatory sweep, checking the monitors, the medication tray, and finally landing on Saada's hand still clasping his mother's. He didn't speak, he didn't have to. The wall of suspicion he projected was thick enough to choke the life out of the room. But as Saad looked up at the Mafia boss, the man the world feared as a monster, she saw something the surveillance cameras could never capture. She saw the way his eyes darted to his mother's face with a frantic, hidden desperation. She saw the minute tremor in his jaw as he watched his mother smile at a stranger. In that split second, the terrifying image of the ruthless leader crumbled. Behind the expensive silk and the cold commands, Saad saw a lonely, terrified boy standing at the edge of a vast, dark ocean, watching the only lighthouse he'd ever known slowly blink out. Min-jae stepped forward, his voice a low, controlled growl as he reminded Saad of the absolute discretion required of her. Yet, as he lectured her on the protocols of care, his hand brushed against a small wooden horse on the mantel, a childhood toy left in a room of shadows. He touched it with a reverence that betrayed his iron-fisted persona. Saad realized then that Min-jae didn't hate her for being there. He hated her because she could provide the one thing his millions and his guns could never buy, a way to reach a mother who was already halfway gone. He wasn't a monster guarding a treasure. He was a child trying to hold back the tide with his bare hands. The following night, the transition was seamless and silent. Under Min-jae's direct orders, a team of technicians moved through the maternal wing with the efficiency of shadows, embedding pinhole lenses into the silver leaf of picture frames and microphones behind the traditional paper screens. By the time the digital clock in Min-jae's private office flickered to midnight, the world of Saad Mensa was no longer private. It was a grid of high-definition feeds illuminating the darkness of his command center. Min-jae leaned back in his leather chair, the glow of the monitors casting a cold, blue pallor over his face as he prepared to witness the mask slip. He expected to see her snooping through drawers for jewelry or perhaps whispering into a burner phone to a rival syndicate. Instead, the screen showed Saad sitting in the dim light of his mother's sitting room, her posture no longer rigid with the quiet strength she wore like armor during the day. She thought she was alone, and in that perceived solitude, her shoulders slumped under the invisible weight of the world. Min-jae watched, his brow furrowed, as she pulled a tattered notebook from her bag. Not to tally stolen goods, but to meticulously record the specific cadence of his mother's breathing and the triggers that had sparked her agitation earlier that evening. There was a clinical devotion in her movements, yet it was layered with a tenderness that made Min-jae's chest tighten with an unfamiliar discomfort. The surveillance feed switched to the bedside camera. Mrs. Kim was trapped in a fitful sleep, her hands grasping at the air in a silent plea. Min-jae watched as Saad approached the bed, not with the hurried efficiency of a hired hand, but with the reverence of a devotee. She didn't wake her. Instead, she began to hum a low, melodic lullaby, a soulful Nigerian rhythm that seemed to bridge the vast distance between Seoul and Atlanta. Through the sensitive microphones, Min-jae heard the sound of a woman who was pouring her own dwindling reserves of hope into a person the rest of the world had already begun to forget. Then, the most jarring revelation occurred. Saad pulled out her phone and initiated a video call. Min-jae tensed, his hand hovering over the record button, certain this was the secret contact his sister had warned him about. But as the screen within his screen flickered to life, he didn't see a mobster. He saw an elderly black man hooked to a ventilator in a room that looked like a temple of poverty and love. He watched Sada's face crumble, the tears she'd been holding back all day finally tracing paths through her weary expression. He heard her whisper promises of a miracle treatment she was buying with the very salary he used to manipulate her. Min-jae sat frozen as he realized that while he was using his power to spy on her, she was using her life to save another. The predator he thought he'd caught was actually a woman drowning in a sea of sacrifice. And for the first time in his life, the boss of the Kim Empire felt the stinging shame of being the one who was truly blind. The stillness of the third night was broken only by the hum of the cooling fans in Min-jae's office, a sound that felt like a growing roar in the vacuum of his conscience. He watched the screen as Saad knelt on the cold hardwood floor of his mother's room, a basin of warm water beside her and a soft towel draped over her shoulder. Mrs. Kim had experienced a sundowning episode earlier, a frantic blur of terror and misplaced memories that had left her physically exhausted and emotionally shattered. Now, she sat slumped in her armchair, her eyes staring blankly at the dark window, her feet swollen and pale. Min-jae leaned in, his Rolex glinting in the pale light of the bank of monitors, his eyes searching for the tell. The sigh of annoyance, the rough handling, or the clinical indifference he had come to expect from the high-priced help. Instead, he saw Saad gently lift his mother's feet with a reverence usually reserved for sacred relics. She didn't use a sponge. She used her bare hands, swirling the water with slow, rhythmic circles that seemed to pull the tension directly out of the old woman's bones. As Saad began to wash away the day's grime, the silence of the room was punctured by a soft, hitching sound that the sensitive microphones captured with brutal clarity. Min-jae watched as Sada's head bowed low, her forehead almost touching his mother's knees. Her shoulders began to shake, and a single, heavy tear splashed into the basin, creating a ripple that distorted the reflection of the two women. She wasn't just tired. She was breaking. He watched her hand tremble as she massaged his mother's heels, her lips moving in a silent prayer or perhaps a conversation with the father she was fighting so hard to save. "I'm sorry, Yama," Saad whispered, using the intimate Korean term for mother she had learned in secret. "I'm sorry you're in so much pain. I'm sorry he can't see you." The words were a serrated blade through the ice Min-jae had built around his heart. He watched her press her tear-stained cheek against his mother's foot, a gesture of such profound, selfless humility that it felt like a physical blow to his chest. In his world, power was measured by who knelt before you, but watching Saad, Min-jae realized he had the definition backward. True power was the strength required to kneel and carry the weight of someone else's suffering without expectation of reward. For the first time, the flawless logic of his surveillance felt like a betrayal of his own humanity. He looked at his own hands, clean, manicured, and utterly useless to the woman who had given him life, and compared them to Sada's, which were wet with the water of service and the salt of genuine grief. The doubt didn't just flicker, it took root. He began to wonder if the spy in the room wasn't the woman on the screen, but the man hiding in the shadows of the monitors, watching a love he no longer deserved to witness. The afternoon sun bled a bruised purple across the horizon, casting long, skeletal shadows over the manicured gardens of the Kim estate. Inside the suite, the air was thick with the scent of lilies and the clinical hum of the pulse oximeter. Mrs. Kim Sun-ok seemed unusually lucid, her eyes tracking the dust motes dancing in the fading light with a startling intensity. Saad was tidying the bedside table when she felt a frail, claw-like grip tighten around her wrist. It wasn't a gesture of confusion, but one of desperate, deliberate intent. Mrs. Kim reached beneath her silk pillow and withdrew a small, velvet pouch, her hands trembling as she pressed it into Sada's palm. With a conspiratorial whisper, she leaned in close. My husband told me to hide this from the shadows, she murmured, her voice a ghost of the authority she once held. He said the one who has the heart to heal, not the hands to take, must keep it. Do not let Min-jae see. In his surveillance room, Min-jae's heart hammered against his ribs like a trapped bird. He leaned so close to the monitor that the pixels blurred into a mosaic of suspicion. He saw the exchange, the furtive movement, the velvet bag, and the way Saad instinctively tucked it into the deep pocket of her scrubs. To his hardened mind, it wasn't a gift of trust. It was the smoking gun he had been waiting for. His sister's warnings about foreign scavengers echoed in his skull, deafening and distorted. He watched Sada's face on the screen, searching for a smirk or a look of greed, but all he saw was a solemn, tearful nod as she whispered a promise he couldn't hear. The paranoia that had been a slow simmering fever now boiled into a psychotic certainty. He was convinced that Saad had finally manipulated his mother's dementia to gain access to the symbolic key, the legendary vault codes, or the hidden ledger of the Kim family's offshore assets. His Rolex felt like a shackle, a reminder of the time he had wasted allowing this woman to infiltrate the most sacred part of his life. He surged to his feet, his chair crashing against the mahogany desk, his knuckles white as he gripped the edge of the console. "Taeyong," he growled into the intercom, his voice vibrating with a dangerous, jagged edge. "Lock down the East Wing. No one enters, and God help her, no one leaves. I'm going in there myself." He watched the screen one last time before storming out, seeing Saad sit back down and gently stroke his mother's hair, her expression one of pure, unadulterated sorrow. To Min-jae, it was the ultimate insult, the performance of a saint while she carried the spoils of a thief in her pocket. He didn't see the key as a bridge back to his own humanity. He saw it as a weapon she had stolen to destroy him. As he tore down the hallway, the red emergency lights of the mansion began to pulse, a rhythmic warning that the fragile peace of the household had finally shattered beyond repair. The lock on the East Wing engaged with a heavy, electronic thud just as the monitors in Min-jae's office exploded with a chaotic symphony of alarms. On the screen, the rhythmic pulse of Mrs. Kim's heart monitor fractured into a jagged, frantic line. She was seizing, her body stiffening as she gasped for air that wouldn't come, her eyes rolling back into a terrifying void. Min-jae froze, his hand trembling on the door handle. He expected Saad to panic, to scream for the guards he had just ordered to stand down, or perhaps to use the confusion to slip away with the velvet pouch. Instead, Saad moved with a focused, surgical calm that defied the violence of the moment. She didn't drop to her knees in fear. She lunged toward the bed, her hands moving with a precision that bypassed the need for thought. She didn't call for help. She became it. Min-jae watched, breathless, as she rolled his mother onto her side to clear her airway, her voice a steady, rhythmic anchor in the storm of the seizure. "I'm here, Yama. Breathe with me. Just breathe," she whispered, the microphones catching the raw, melodic desperation in her tone. When the seizure subsided, leaving Mrs. Kim gray and unresponsive, Saad didn't stop. She realized his mother had stopped breathing. Min-jae's vision blurred as he watched Saad begin chest compressions, the rhythmic thump-thump of her efforts echoing through the speakers like a second heartbeat. She wasn't just performing a medical procedure. She was fighting a war against death for a woman she had no blood relation to. Every shove of her hands was a defiance of the Mafia logic Min-jae had lived by, the belief that everyone has an angle and no one gives for free. The door finally gave way, and Min-jae stumbled into the room, his weapon drawn, his mind still poisoned by the suspicion of the stolen key. He stopped dead at the foot of the bed. Saad was hunched over his mother, her face drenched in sweat and tears, her own breath ragged as she forced life back into Mrs. Kim's lungs. The velvet pouch had fallen from her pocket, spilling its contents onto the floor. It wasn't a ledger or a code. It was a tarnished, brass key to the small music box Min-jae had given his mother when he was 7 years old, the only memory of his sweet boy self she had managed to keep. Mrs. Kim gasped, a thin, rattling sound that signaled her return to the world. Saad collapsed back against the mattress, her hands shaking, her scrub stained with the water she had used to wash his mother's feet just hours before. She looked up at Min-jae, not with the fire of a thief caught in the act, but with the profound, weary sorrow of a daughter who had just saved her mother. The weight of his own monstrousness finally broke him. The gun clattered to the floor, and Jang Min-jae, the man who believed control was the only virtue, felt his legs give way. He dropped to his knees at Sada's feet, his forehead resting against the edge of the bed, a broken sob finally escaping the throat that had only ever known how to command. He realized then that Saad wasn't the threat to his empire. She was the only thing standing between him and the complete loss of his soul. The silence following Min-jae's breakdown was short-lived, shattered by the sharp vibration of his encrypted phone. He didn't move from his knees, his forehead still pressed against the mahogany bed frame, as the voice of Taeyong filled the room with a cold, urgent precision. The Yakuza had been watching. They had seen the East Wing go into lockdown, sensed the shift in the mansion's rhythm, and correctly interpreted the boss's sudden vulnerability. In the twisted logic of their world, Saad was no longer just a caregiver. She was a vital organ, the very heart of Jang Min-jae, and she was currently exposed. "Sir, we have motion on the perimeter," Taeyong reported, his voice tight with the strain of impending violence. "They aren't testing the gates. They're coming through the garden. They know about the midnight routine." Min-jae's head snapped up. The midnight routine was when Saad went to tend the medicinal herbs she had planted for his mother. A routine he had watched with suspicion, now realized as an act of pure devotion. He looked at Saad, who was still trembling from the effort of saving his mother's life. She was pale, exhausted, and utterly unaware that she had become the primary target in a war she never signed up for. He surged to his feet, the armor of the Mafia boss snapping back into place, but this time it was forged with a different purpose. He didn't look at the monitors to spy, he looked at them to hunt. On the thermal feed, 6 heat signatures moved like ghosts through the mugwort and Korean mint Saad had meticulously cultivated. They were armed, efficient, and closing in on the wing where the 2 women sat. Min-jae realized with a sickening jolt that his own surveillance had provided the blueprint for this assault. By watching her every move, he had mapped out her path for his enemies. "Stay here," Min-jae commanded, his voice a low, vibrating rasp. He reached out, his hand hovering inches from Sada's shoulder before he finally allowed himself to touch her. A brief, grounding pressure. "Lock the door. Do not open it for anyone but me. Do you understand?" Saad nodded, her eyes wide with a new kind of terror, her hand instinctively clutching the brass key she had returned to the old woman. She saw the monster in him once more, but this time, he wasn't looking at her as prey. He was looking at the door as a shield. As he turned to leave, the first window in the lower gallery shattered. The Yakuza weren't just looking for leverage. They were looking to tear out the heart of the Kim organization by taking the woman who had dared to heal it. Min-jae drew his weapon, his eyes reflecting the red pulse of the emergency lights. He had spent years building a fortress to protect his empire, but as he stepped into the hallway to face the shadows, he realized he was finally fighting for the only thing in the mansion that actually mattered. The hunt had begun, and Jang Min-jae was prepared to turn his home into a graveyard to ensure that Saad Mensa remained untouched. The gun smoke still hung in the air of the hallway when Min-jae returned to the master's suite, his knuckles bruised and his chest heaving with a jagged, adrenaline-fueled breath. The threat had been neutralized, the Yakuza ghosts driven back into the shadows of the garden. But the true reckoning was only just beginning. Saad stood by the window, her back to the door, her hands still shaking as she clutched the tattered notebook that held the secrets of his mother's survival. When she turned to face him, the fire in her eyes was more terrifying than any weapon he had faced tonight. "Tell me," she whispered, her voice a low, vibrating blade. "Tell me how they knew exactly when I'd be in that garden. Tell me why this house feels like a prison with invisible eyes." Min-jae didn't flinch. The boss who ruled with silence and iron was gone, replaced by a man who had seen his own soul mirrored in a basin of washwater. He walked to the center of the room and gestured to a small, nearly imperceptible glint behind a mahogany crown molding. "It isn't a feeling, Saad. It's the truth. He took a breath, the weight of his admission pulling at the corners of his mouth. I've been watching you, every moment, every prayer, every tear you shed for a father you're afraid you can't save. The silence that followed was suffocating. Saad stepped back, the betrayal washing over her face in waves of disbelief and raw, jagged pain. You spied on me? While I was cleaning your mother's body. While I was crying to my father because I didn't know if I'd ever see him again. She let out a short, bitter laugh that sounded like glass breaking. You didn't see a caregiver. You saw a suspect. You saw a thief. I saw a saint, and I called it a con, Min-jae replied, his voice breaking under the gravity of his shame. I was raised to believe that love was a currency and trust was a death sentence. My father taught me to watch the shadows, so that's all I looked for in you. He moved closer, ignoring the way she flinched. But those cameras didn't show me your guilt, Saad. They showed me my own. They showed me that I've been a stranger in my own home, a man who knows the price of everything and the value of nothing. That doesn't make it okay, she spat, her voice thick with the salt of fresh tears. You used your power to violate the only thing I had left, my privacy, my dignity. I know, he said, dropping his gaze to the velvet pouch on the floor. And I will spend every day I have left trying to earn back a fraction of the respect I've lost. But the Yakuza saw what I saw. They saw that you are the heart of this house. They saw that I would burn this city to the ground to keep you safe. He looked up, his eyes raw and searching. In my world, you are now a weakness. But in my heart, you are the only truth I've ever found. I'm not asking for your forgiveness. I'm asking for the chance to protect the woman who taught me how to be a son again. The heavy silence of the master suite was punctuated only by the rhythmic, mechanical beep of the heart monitor. A reminder of the fragile life Saad had just clawed back from the edge. Min-jae stood before her, the adrenaline of the garden assault replaced by a sobering clarity that felt more dangerous than any gunfight. He knew that despite the Yakuza's retreat, the gates of his mansion were no longer a barrier. They were a target. He looked at Saad, whose hands were still stained with the water she had used to wash his mother's feet, and realized that her goodness had made her a beacon for every shadow in Seoul. The threat isn't over, Saad, he began, his voice dropping to a low, solemn rasp. My enemies have seen that you are the only person who can reach me. In my world, that makes you a liability they will try to liquidate or leverage every single day. Saada's gaze flickered to the bed where his mother lay sleeping, then back to Min-jae, her chin lifting with a weary defiance. Then I'll go back to Atlanta, she whispered. I'll take the money I've earned and disappear. Min-jae shook his head slowly. They won't let you reach the airport. And even if you did, you would be looking over your shoulder for the rest of your life. He took a step toward her, not as a captor, but as a man offering a desperate alliance. There is one way to make you untouchable. One way to send a message to the syndicates that any hand raised against you is a hand raised against the entire Kim lineage. He paused, the words heavy with the gravity of a blood oath. Become a Kim, not as an employee, but as my wife. Saad stared at him, the absurdity of the proposal clashing with the grim reality of the bullet holes in the hallway. You're proposing a marriage of protection? She asked, her voice trembling. I'm offering you my name, Min-jae replied, his eyes steady and raw. It carries a weight that transcends business. As my wife, you are protected by laws even the Yakuza fear to break. He reached into his pocket and pulled out his phone, his thumb hovering over a banking app. The moment you agree, your father's medical bills are paid in full. He will be moved to the best facility in the world, under my personal security detail. You will never have to worry about the cost of his breath again. And what do I have to do? Saad asked softly. You continue to be the daughter my mother's heart chose, Min-jae said, a ghost of a smile touching his lips. You stay, you heal her, and you help me remember how to be the man she thinks I am. Saad looked at Mrs. Kim, then at the brass key resting on the nightstand, the bridge between the monster and the sun. She saw the path of sacrifice she had walked since Atlanta, and for the first time she saw a way to finish it. She reached out and placed her hand over his. On one condition, she said, her voice reclaiming its iron strength. You remove every single camera. You look at me with your own eyes, not through a screen. We build a home, Minjae, not a fortress. Minjae nodded, the final bit of his armor falling away. I promise. As the sun began to rise over Seoul, a new family began. Not one born of blood or romance, but of a shared, desperate need for redemption and the quiet, stubborn power of a love that refused to be spied upon.